The speaker of the hour is Brother Derek Yarber. Derek graduated from Southwest Missouri State University, which is now Missouri State University in West Plains, in the spring of 2005. He then attended the Bible Institute of Missouri, graduating from it in 2007. Derek married his best friend and college sweetheart, Vanessa, on August 18, 2007. They have since been blessed with 3 children, Reagan, Colby, and Kyler. For 4.5 years, Derek worked with the Camdenton Church of Christ on a full-time basis. In November of 2011, he began serving with the Conway Church, in which he continues to labor to the present. In his spare time, Derek enjoys spending time with his wife and kids, fishing, and playing and watching sports. Derek's topic and lesson for this session is the challenge to realize the dangers of false teachers.
Well, it's been a week of challenges, lots of challenging lessons that have been put before us, and of course these challenges are as churches and on an individual basis as Christians. Well, I've personally been given a challenge, and that's to give a sermon without one sports illustration. And you have my word, I will accomplish that in this session. And just pay attention, see if it's not the case. We'll see if I can accomplish this challenge. As people go through school, they have a lot of teachers, some assigned to them and some that they get to choose. It's really hard being young because when you're little, you don't get to choose your teachers. You have to go to where you're assigned. But as you start to get older and you're in junior high and then in high school, you get to start picking your teachers. You move into college and you get to pick your teachers. And that's helpful because you can do a lot of research into them to make sure that you don't get a lemon for a teacher. Now, the unfortunate side of things is when you then enter into preaching school, you don't get to pick your teachers anymore. They are assigned to you. I had Brother Chuck Northrup assigned to me. That wasn't my choice, okay? I just want you to know that. But I'm glad, looking back though, I am a little bit glad that he was assigned to me because, you know, he's a pretty good teacher. He did a good job. These guys out here as well, I'm grateful that the Solons family, they were assigned to me. Appreciate you guys and the school. So good to meet all the incoming class and some of the returning too. Thankful for each of you. What an exciting thing for them. In all seriousness, though, about teachers in school, that is the truth, that you don't always get to select the teachers that you want. But whenever you can, you're sure to do so to make sure that you don't get a bad teacher. Now, we understand that that's really important in a secular way, but my question for us to consider in this study is, do we view our spiritual education in as significant of a light? Do we watch out for lemons as teachers to make sure that we don't get bad ones? For the passage that's been assigned to me, we're only going to be looking at one teacher who so happens to be a false one in this short period that we have. And I'm glad that's the case. I don't at all want to be critical of looking at passages that say do this or don't do that. They're important, they're great, they're wonderful. But I really like stories in general, and especially I like stories from the Scripture because they help to bring to light what plain biblical teaching is. It helps us to make sense because it's making application of something that we've been told. So we're going to look at the account of a particular false teacher that the Apostle Paul encountered so that we can learn applicationally some good lessons about what do we do with these false teachers when we encounter them. How might they want to interact with us? And what should be our outset look for them as we move forward? We're going to notice a few things in this lesson about a man who is named Alexander. And this man, Alexander, did some really hurtful things to individual Christians, and this really starts with Paul the Apostle. Now, the text for our study is 2 Timothy chapter 4. 2 Timothy 4, and we're going to be looking at verses 14 and 15, and really that's it as far as the parameters of our study goes. But verse 14 of 2 Timothy 4, Paul says, Alexander the coppersmith did me much evil. He then asserts why that's the case. Verse 15, for he hath greatly withstood our words. If you know anything about the Apostle Paul, which I know everybody here does, you know that he was a good guy who only spoke the truth. Therefore, he was a true teacher. But if someone were to stand up against Paul and contradict what it is with words that he's speaking, it could only be because this individual was saying that which was false. And if the person is contradicting Paul, saying that which was false, that could only make him a false teacher. We never find the statement in the Bible, Alexander the coppersmith was a false teacher, but it doesn't take a lot of common sense to understand that's the case. This man was contradicting the words that Paul spoke, which were true, therefore he was a false teacher. Now there's something that I want to identify about this man's trade which seems totally insignificant, but it's awfully intriguing that the Spirit would insert what it is this guy does in the very little information that we have concerning him. He was a coppersmith, which could mean that he specialized in working with copper, but it's not necessarily limited to that. He could have also specialized in iron. He possibly as well had some dabblings with gold or some other metals according to the meaning of the term in the original language. But generally we would think of Alexander being a blacksmith. He worked with metal, and it probably is that his specialty was working with copper. And I know that seems like it doesn't amount to anything, but it is important as we cross from our main text in 2 Timothy 4 to spend some time now in Acts chapter 19. As we do that, you're going to be thinking to yourself, why in the world are we here? What does this have to do with false teaching? What does it have to do with Alexander? I just beg you, please stay with me for a little while, and in the end it's going to make a lot of sense. Acts chapter 19. Remember, this false teacher had interaction with Paul, and I want us to go back into the biblical history to try to find out when and where this took place and what exactly occurred between these two. Well, in verse 1 of Acts 19, we're told it came to pass that while Apollos was at Corinth, Paul, having passed through the upper coast, came to Ephesus. I'm going to provide some geographical viewpoint of where we are and what's going on in just a moment. But for now, let's look into verses 8 through 10 to see what's taking place. This is important. In the big, booming city of that time of Ephesus. Verses 8 through 10, Paul went into the synagogue as he typically did when he entered into a city, granted after encountering these disciples who had been baptized with the baptism of John. He corrects that with them. Well, he then goes into the synagogue and he speaks boldly for the space of 3 months, disputing and persuading the things concerning the kingdom of God. But when divers were hardened, these aren't people out in the water with scuba gear, it's an old British word that means many. When many were hardened and believed not, but spake evil of that way, the teachings of Jesus and the practices that are attached to it, they spake evil of that way before the multitude. He, Paul, departed from them and separated the disciples, disputing daily in the school of one Tyrannus. And this continued by the space of 2 years, so that all they which dwelt in Asia heard the word of the Lord Jesus, both Jews and Greeks. I'm going to try to pull off a minor miracle and turn back, staying close to the mic while also being able to use my laser pointer. Paul had spent a good amount of time. We know from Acts 18 he had spent 1.5 years in the city of Corinth. After that he leaves and he sails. He doesn't go directly to these places, but we find out that Paul, from chapter 19, the opening of it, went into the upper coasts of an area where he's going to be in Asia Minor. It's probably a reference to the high tableland of Bithynia and Galatia, where Paul desired to go in chapter 16, but if you recall, the Spirit forbade him at that point from doing such a thing, and the Macedonian call comes in. Well, he finally, it appears, gets to go to the place in Acts 19 where he wanted to go for some time, Bithynia and Galatia, high in elevation, so happens to also be north. He goes from there southwest, ending up in the lowland, the seaport city of Ephesus. Ephesus is a big deal at that time. Because it is a coastal city and has a port there, there's all kinds of trade that comes through. It's a tremendous opportunity for Paul to spread the gospel. And that's what he's doing, as we've noted, for a couple of years in Ephesus. Tremendous opportunity. Good things are taking place. Well, verses 11 through 17 tell us that God was working special miracles by the hands of Paul. Well, then certain of the vagabond, which are just these wandering Jews, exorcists, they say to these evil spirits, just like Paul was, the remarkable miracles that were taking place is that Paul had the indestructible man Kleenex. You know, the type you use and you don't have to throw away, handkerchiefs. You just keep using them over and over. He had a handkerchief, and as well he had aprons, not for the time he spent in the kitchen probably, although he might have been able to cook too, but he used this in his work of tent making. And so these Kleenexes, if you will, these handkerchiefs and these aprons were taken to people who were ill and were demon-possessed, and just by touching them, the sickness or the demon, respectively, immediately would go out of the person. That's unusual even for Bible miracles. But that's going on here because of the great opportunity to reach out to people, God showing these miracles, confirming the word that Paul is speaking. Well, there are these Jewish exorcists that aren't part of the faith, and they say, this is really neat, we want to do that too. So they say to these evil spirits at the end of verse 13, we adjure you by Jesus whom Paul preacheth. 7 sons of Sceva, one of the chief priests, did so. And the evil spirit answered and said, all right, Jesus I know. I know Paul as well, but who do you think you are? The man in whom the evil spirit was leaped on them, overcame them, and prevailed against them, which is a really nice way of saying beat the tar out of them. So they fled out of that house naked and wounded. This was known to all dwelling at Ephesus, and the name of the Lord Jesus, because of it, was magnified. Folks, unbelievers were taking note of what was transpiring, and people are being converted to the Lord left and right in Ephesus. But not just from the outside. There are also some members of the church that have gone wayward, and as they're seeing these things that are taking place, they take note of the true power of God being worked in this place as well. Acts 19, 18 through 20, many that believed came and confessed and showed their deeds. Many of them also which used curious, which are magical arts, brought their books together and burned them before all men, and they counted the price of them and found it 50,000 pieces of silver. So mightily grew the word of the Lord and just continued to prevail. If you're thinking, how in the world could members of the Lord's church get tied up into black magic? How could that ever transpire? We have to understand the city of Ephesus. Because of the tremendous commerce and money that's passing through this place, it was a melting pot of cultures. There are a few places that you can live, not travel the world, and get to know the world really well. For instance, in our country, if you don't have the chance to go from country to country to country, like most of us do not, and quite frankly, right now, you might just not want to because of all of the dangers that exist outside of our borders. But if you wanted to get in touch with the world quite well, just go live in New York City or Los Angeles for a while. Pretty good melting pot of cultures in both places, right? You can get to know the world quite well. Same thing is taking place in Ephesus, which there are some positives about that and there are some negatives. The positives is you do get exposed to other ways of living than your own, and you get to know people from different places better. But in fairness, there's also a downside to it. You're exposed to every idea and philosophy under the sun, both good and most of the time bad, including magical arts, so that many Christians are even caught up in this practice, committing sorcery and separating themselves through sin from their God. When they see the true power of God at work, they turn from these magical, which are pseudo practices, and they turn to this power that's being worked through Paul. It's interesting that the very definition of the term occult, not a cult, C-U-L-T, but occult, O-C-C-U-L-T, is magical practices, but literally the word means hidden or secretive. These people were practicing occult-type rituals, O-C-C-U-L-T, literally meaning hidden or secretive practices. But when they see the true power of God being worked before them, they confess their sins, which means to reveal or to make known. You see, concerning their sin, they're trying to keep that under the rug in a secret. But when they turn to the power of God, they want everybody to know about it. And they have to make a real sacrifice to be right with God economically. They bring all of these books together. And I want you to note that they didn't have a giant church garage sale to get rid of these, to try to get back some of their funds still, and just other people are going to be working these sins other than they. They recognize these are not fit to be on the planet. It's just as wrong for anyone else to use these as it is us. Let's just get rid of them. And so they burn these books, and as they do so, the total price of them is counted to be 50,000 pieces of silver, which means absolutely zero in 21st century America. Depending on what piece of silver is being referenced here, estimates are on the low end, the total value would be around $10,000 American currency, to as much as perhaps greater than $25,000. I don't care who you are and what you do for a living. That's a chunk of change. That is a lot of money in the richest country in the history of the world. You're talking about one of the poorest societies overall, the Roman Empire, and a common person. That is a ton of money to those people. But they see it as a worthy sacrifice to cut off some economics so that they can be right with God. Not everyone in Ephesus feels like that's a good idea. Verses 23 through 27, there arose no small stir about that way, for Demetrius, a silversmith, note, not a coppersmith, but a silversmith, a blacksmith whose specialty was in silver, which made silver shrines for Diana, brought no small gain unto the craftsmen, whom he called together with the workmen of like occupation. In other words, he brings together other blacksmiths, maybe not necessarily whose familiarity is more with silver than anything else, but they're also workers of metal. And he says, sirs, do you realize by this craft we have our wealth? And at Ephesus, in fairness, he also says throughout the world, but at Ephesus now we're really concerned, this Paul hath persuaded and turned away much people, saying, they be no gods which are made with hands, so this craft of ours is in danger. What are we going to do about this, guys? If we don't do something about this Paul and those who are working with him, we might lose our wealth, because this is our business. We have in our large city the worship of this goddess Diana. You ever heard of the Temple of Artemis? You don't normally hear the Temple of Diana. Really, they're the same thing. The only difference is in Roman mythology, it was Diana. In Greek mythology, same person, if you will, same idea, probably better stated, is Artemis. There's not a lot of that left in the old part of Ephesus anymore, and I'm sure whatever is there has been reinforced for economic reasons today. But there's not a lot left standing of the Temple of Artemis. But back in the day, from what sketches of it are made and estimates, there's nothing quite like it. It was actually one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Antipater of Sidon was the fellow who put together the list of the ancient 7 wonders and had seen all of them in person. And he goes through and he talks about each one of them. He goes through the Hanging Gardens and he mentions the large pyramids that would reach up seemingly to the sun. But when he talks about the Temple of Artemis, he says all those other wonders lost their majesty. There's nothing like this. Folks, the Temple of Artemis was the Mount Rushmore of Asia Minor. Everybody there loved it. They were proud of it. Everybody, obviously, than true Christians. And people would travel the world. It would be on people's bucket list to go see this place. If they would ever have the opportunity, they wanted to see this place. And because of all the tourism that is coming through, you have these blacksmiths and in different types of trades, whether it be in copper or in gold or in iron or in silver, that would make these little shrines. One that you see here is an actual one of Diana/Artemis. And by the way, Diana/Artemis is a big deal to the Romans as well as to the Greeks at this point. Artemis was the alleged goddess of the animal kingdom, of hunts, of virginity, of childbirth, was the daughter of Zeus. Now, you don't get any bigger than that. The daughter of Zeus and the twin sibling of Apollo. Diana/Artemis is a big deal. And these people aren't about to turn away from her and cut into their pocketbook. I hope you're still asking, what in the world does this have to do with their study? I'm just about to that point. Verses 28 through 30. The people, were full of wrath, the fellow craftsmen of Demetrius, the blacksmiths. They cried out, I don't think so, Paul. Great is Diana of the Ephesians, and the whole city, having caught Gaius and Aristarchus, Paul's companions in travel, they rushed into the theater. When Paul would have entered in, the disciples suffered him not. No, you're not going to get mixed up in that mess in there. Some, therefore, though in this assembly in the theater, the whole cities come together, cried one thing, some another. For the assembly was confused, and the more part knew not wherefore they were come together. Listen to this, verse 33. Alexander, the Jews put forward, and Alexander would have made his defense unto the people, and he waves his hand to them, trying to get their attention so that he could do so. Remember who Demetrius called together all of his buddies? Fellow craftsmen, fellow blacksmiths, part of whom would have been coppersmiths. Alexander the coppersmith. Well, about this individual and bringing this whole group together, the whole city ran into the theater. Like the temple of Artemis, there are some remnants of the theater of Ephesus. And just from a bird's eye view, you can get a pretty good idea. This was a large place. Conservative estimates are that at one time you could easily fit in 25 to 30,000 people in this Ephesian theater. Some estimates are as high as 56,000. Now, to put this in perspective, just a little bit, a few hours southwest of here, you have the arena where the Oklahoma City Thunder play basketball. It is Chesapeake Energy Arena, in which you can fit a little over 18,000 people. I've never been there to watch a basketball game. Maybe some of you have, but I asked a buddy of mine who has been there several times. When that's a capacity crowd, you get down on the floor and the crowd's all excited in the game. If you, without microphones, remember they didn't have them back in Paul's time, without microphone, do you think you could talk to people in the stands and they could hear you? He said there's not a chance. Do you realize the capacity of the Ephesian theater was at least twice that of Chesapeake Energy Arena? Maybe as much as 3 times. I know there are those of you sitting there thinking, Sports Illustration, you lied. No, I didn't. Chuck challenged me not to use one Sports Illustration in my lesson, so I'm going to use 2. Imagine for our locals being in Arrowhead Stadium with 2/3 of the crowd in there, all doing the war chant together, and you're down on the field trying to talk to the people in the stands without a microphone. You think they're going to be able to hear anything you say? Well, that's where Alexander finds himself. He's trying to let everyone know, hey, we've called this assembly together for a reason. We need to deal with this Paul character and his buddies. But nobody can hear him, and they just keep doing not their war chant, but their own chant. When they knew that he was a Jew, all about the space of 2 hours cried out, "Great is Diana of the Ephesians!" When the town clerk had appeased the people, he said, "You ought to be quiet and do nothing rashly. Ye have brought hither these men which are neither robbers of churches nor blasphemers of your goddess. Wherefore, if Demetrius and the craftsmen which are with him have a matter against any man, the law is open, and there are deputies. Let them implead one another. But if ye inquire anything concerning other matters, it shall be determined in a lawful assembly." The point of which is this: they're in an unlawful assembly, wishing to do unlawful things to Paul, all who they don't have in their midst, but to his comrades, Gaius and Aristarchus. Alexander is a part of the one who spearheads this action. He wants to harm Paul the apostle, and if he can do anything about it, he wants to kill him. Let me tell you something. False teachers of any kind are dangerous, but the ones that are willing to gain $1 or are not willing to part with $1 and would rather you die than that happen are the most dangerous of all. This man is dangerous to individual Christians, whether you look at Paul, Gaius, or Aristarchus. But more significantly, he's dangerous to the cause of Christianity. Verse 15 of 2 Timothy 4, Paul says, "Of whom, Timothy, you be thou ware." We would just say, be aware, or beware also, for he hath greatly withstood our words. By the way, it's a perfect tense verbiage that's being used here, the action of which has begun in the past and continues into the present. In the past, he resisted our words, and he continues to do so moving forward, even into the present. You'd better look out for him. We've heard this week, and we know it well, that a servant isn't greater than his master. If they did that with Jesus, they're going to do that with it. I'm not trying to make Paul out to be Jesus here, but he did go before us. And if they did that to Paul, what Paul is saying is Alexander's going to do the same thing to you as well. It's not really personal, even though it involves persons. It's a greater thing. It's about the cause. If false teachers did it toward Paul, they would do it toward Timothy. If they did it toward Timothy, they'll do it toward you and I as well whenever we promote the cause of Jesus Christ. Look out for them. They're dangerous. Just want to make sure, though, that we've made this right connection. Now, remember, you have Alexander the coppersmith in 2 Timothy 4. Beware of him. Look out, Timothy. He's done some harm to me as well. Well, you have this Alexander who's a blacksmith of some sort in Ephesus in Acts chapter 19. Coincidentally, notice where it was that Paul had left Timothy for a time. 1 Timothy chapter 1, the first letter he pens to him, verse 3, as I besought thee to abide still at Ephesus. Coincidentally, same place. When I went into Macedonia, that thou mightest charge some that they teach no other doctrine. Verses 6 and 7, from which some having swerved have turned aside unto vain jangling, which means idle talk, desiring to be teachers of the law, understanding neither what they say, nor whereof they affirm. There is a danger with really sharp false teachers. There may be a more dangerous class, and those are the ones that are as ignorant as a box of rocks. Maybe that Paul has him in mind right here. Alexander doesn't even realize the things that he's saying. They're dangerous to the cause of Jesus Christ. Timothy, I'm leaving you behind in Ephesus. So how would you like to be Timothy? We have this guy who tried to maybe put us in prison or beat us, maybe even try to take our lives. I'm going to move on down the road and do some work over here. I'm going to leave you here. Look out for him, though. He might come after you, too. How would you like to be Timothy? Wouldn't you think, Paul, won't you stay back here, buddy, with me for a while? No, I got to go on, man. How's he going to take care of this all by himself? We were learning earlier about how we can't take matters into our own hands. You have someone who tries to kill you, and we're not going to try to respond by killing them. So what are we supposed to do? How can we overcome that evil? Brother Randy, maybe it's with good. 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 2. Paul says to Timothy, this is the way you do it. You preach the word. You better be ready in season and out of season, reprove, rebuke, exhort with all longsuffering and doctrine. For the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but after their own lusts shall they heap to themselves teachers having itching ears. And they shall turn away their ears from the truth and shall be turned unto fables. The instruction here really isn't just wait, and if any false teaching creeps up, then you need to go out there, get after it, and squelch it. Put out the fire. That's not what he's saying here. He's saying you teach the truth always, yes, in that situation, but you also do it beforehand. What is it that they say, that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure? We can keep false teaching from rearing its ugly head, and that's even better than letting it arise and then having to deal with a much greater problem then. Have you ever noticed that congregations that turn away from the truth and to false ideas, once they do that, very rarely do they ever come back? I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm simply suggesting 9 times out of 10 it doesn't happen. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. How do we prevent that from taking place? You just keep talking about the word, because once people turn away from it, it's not very likely you're ever going to get them to come back. Keep them from ever turning to it in the first place. I think we get that false teachers are dangerous to an individual. They're dangerous to the church at large. But maybe sometimes we lose sight of the truth that false teachers are dangerous to themselves. Verse 14 of 2 Timothy 4, Paul says, the Lord reward him, Alexander, according to his works. The King James translates it in this way, and most of our English translations do, in what's called the optative mood in Greek, which indicates a strong wish. Other renditions of it will have it along the lines of, may the Lord reward him according to his works. And it may be that's the tone with which Paul intends to say what he does. But it might not be too. It's a future active indicative verb, which is a big way of saying it's future tense. And what he could be saying is, the Lord will reward or repay him according to his works. One thing's for sure, I don't think that Paul had his pom-poms out and he was shaking them and doing his chants about how he couldn't wait until Alexander stepped through the gates of hell. I don't believe that's what he has in mind here. In fact, in his first letter to Timothy, chapter 1, verses 18 through 20, he says, "This charge I commit unto thee, son Timothy, according to the prophecies which went before on thee, that thou by them mightest wage war a good warfare, holding faith and a good conscience, which some having put away concerning faith have made shipwreck." Listen to this. "Of whom is Alexander, whom I have delivered unto Satan." And here's the reason behind it. "That they," including not only Alexander, but also Hymenaeus, "that they may learn not to blaspheme." I don't think the strong action that Paul took out against Alexander was to say, "Man, I'm done with you forever, and you just wait until you see the devil." He did what he did so that he would have the chance to reform his actions, and maybe by the grace of God, if he would turn, one day be able to step through the pearly gates to see God. That's what he wanted for him. But there would have to be a reformation of character to take place if that were to ever transpire. The million-dollar question becomes this. What does Paul mean by, "I delivered this guy unto Satan"? Good question. Perhaps a passage that's similar in its contents would have something to say about it. 1 Corinthians, the 5th chapter, there's the inspired addition by the same writer to the text, "Whom I deliver such a one to Satan for the destruction of the flesh." It could be that Paul performed a miracle not for or on behalf of, as in to benefit Alexander. It might have been to harm him in the flesh. There is biblical precedence for such a thing. Numbers chapter 12, when of all people, Miriam and Aaron, the siblings of Moses, lead this rebellion against him and the authority which God has given to him. God comes down and he talks to the three of them. He's extremely angry, Clint, as he does so. He's very mad and he talks to them. And when he leaves, Miriam, the ringleader of the opposition, is stricken with leprosy. Moses pleads for her to be healed. And God, by his grace, after 7 days, does take that plague away. Because he never wanted to permanently afflict Miriam anyway. He wanted to use a miracle to teach her a lesson. You don't tinker with the power and the authority of God. As well in the New Testament, Acts the 13th chapter, you have a man named Sergius Paulus who has been converted to Christianity. And there is this gentleman who is a sorcerer, Elymas, who tries to turn the proconsul away from the faith. As he does so, Paul, being quite irritated, I'm sure, strikes him with blindness. The scriptures say, for a season. In other words, it wasn't the will of God for this man never to see again, but for a period not to do so, so that he would be taught an all-important lesson. You don't tinker with the power and the authority of God. Turn to the true side of power and follow the Lord instead. It may be the delivering of Alexander to Satan could be for the destruction of the flesh. That is, a miracle might have been worked against him to teach him a lesson. Or it might be as well, as in both cases, 1 Corinthians 5, 1 Timothy 1, it might just be a reference to some type of discipline from God's people being exercised to this one. It could be, I don't know that we know for certain, but it could be that Alexander had converted at some point and had turned away, not wanting to make that sacrifice in economics to continue to be right with God. It might be that the church had exercised some discipline toward him. In either case, it would be for the same reason, to try to get the man to turn away from false and to true teaching. That's what we should want for every false teacher. We don't want them to be lost forever. We want them to turn from error to teach truth and to be right with God. Now, with that being said, we don't want to lose sight of who false teachers can be. Jesus refers to them in the 7th chapter of Matthew as fierce, ravage, ferocious wolves. Now, I don't think we have any wolves in Missouri. Maybe there's a report every now and then of them, but we have enough common sense. If we saw one out in the wild, we're not going to walk up to it, start sweet-talking it, and stroking its pretty fur. It might turn back on us and devour us. They're nasty, mean creatures. False teachers can be that. We want to be careful. But only by the power of God can they be made into something very different with the implementation of His Word into their hearts. God has the power to take a ferocious wolf and to turn that creature into a humble sheep. And so when we spot those spiritual wolves, we shouldn't want to set up in our tree stands 200 yards away with our elephant rifles ready to take them out so that they're once for all gone from the planet. Let's give them a chance by teaching them the truth, to turn from their erroneous ways and to be right with God. Folks, if God hadn't exhibited that same type of love and patience with us, where would we be today? But glory be to Him that He has. We don't want these fierce wolves to remain that way. We want them to be transformed by the power of God's teachings into lowly sheep. But until they do, let's be wise and recognize them for who they are. For the time being, they're fierce wolves, and we would be wise as individuals and as God's people to beware of them.